All right, so this is our chapter on moral development. And there's three different components of morality. So the cognitive component has to do with understanding kind of the ethical rules and making judgments about whether things are good or bad. And so, how would I feel if I don't feel good, then I shouldn't do it. So thinking about what's the right thing to do. The behavioral component is the actual decisions that are made, what kids actually do. So if you have the opportunity to cheat, do you actually take advantage of that? And then the emotional or affective component is kids' feelings about engaging in those good or bad behaviors. So do you feel guilt or empathy, things like that. So we see a lot of behaviors motivated by negative emotion. But all of these different components go into our moral decision making. So there's a number of different theories about moral behavior. Piaget had a theory about moral judgment, and this really focuses on the cognitive component. So on thinking about the rightness or wrongness of a given act. And he, of course, believed that kids need a basic level of cognitive ability to make these decisions. He argued that moral development, like cognitive development, is an invariant sequence and gave kids these moral dilemmas and looked at how they decided what to do, not what they decided. So, for example, he would describe, John, who was going into the cabinet to get something his parents asked him to get and broke 3 glasses versus Henry, who was sneaking into the cabinet to do something he wasn't supposed to do and only broke 1 glass. And basically Piaget would say which kid was worse and why. So at the pre-moral stage, in the first 5 years, Piaget argued that kids have little awareness or understanding of rules. They don't play games according to the rules. They make them up so that they win. They don't have a sense of morality. In the moral realism stage, from ages 5 to 10, they have a great respect for the rules and apply them inflexibly. So they have kind of this sense of moral absolutism, which is they very rigidly apply the rules regardless of the circumstances. And they have this sense of imminent justice, where they believe that any deviation from the rule will be punished. And then finally, around age 10, they get to moral reciprocity, where they recognize that the rules can sometimes be questioned and altered. They think about the feelings of others, and they're really able to balance intentions and consequences. Okay, so Piaget's theory, his research was really focused on Western cultures, and theory in those cultures supports this, but findings in other cultures have been less consistent. So, for example, in Native American tribes, the belief in imminent justice increases rather than decreases with age. He also tended to underestimate kids' capabilities, so the general structure that he used of using these stories was kind of flawed, where he confounded intention and consequences. So in one scenario, there was little harm or little consequences, but bad intention. And the other scenario had lots of consequences, but good intention. And so it made it difficult for kids to kind of make those decisions. When you give kids simpler questions, they're able to consider both intentions and actions. So Kohlberg is probably the bigger name that's associated with moral judgment, and he also had a cognitive theory. His original research focused on boys ages 10 to 16, and like Piaget, he gave them moral dilemmas and was interested in how they came to their decisions, and again, he saw it as a universal and invariant sequence. So he'd have a scenario something like, a woman has cancer, she's got 6 months to live, she's in pain. The pain medicine is going to make her die sooner because she's weak. She asks the doctor to give her enough of it to kill her because she just can't stand the pain and she's going to die anyways. But of course, mercy killing is against the law. And so the doctor is debating whether or not to grant her the request. And so Kohlberg would ask, should the doctor grant the request and why? So the first level is the pre-conventional level. And so here, the rules are kind of seen as external to oneself. They're not internalized, and the goal is really to avoid punishment and get personal reward. So kids in this stage are very egocentric. They're about what's satisfying for them. So in the first stage, they're really focusing on what's good or bad depends on the consequences. So if you're not going to get punished, it's not wrong. If you're going to get a severe punishment, they judge the behavior as worse. If they use the next stage is seeking rewards. So this is all about gaining rewards and satisfying their needs. So they're concerned about others only because they hope to benefit themselves. So I'll help you if you help me kind of mentality. The next level is the conventional level. And here, moral judgment is based on the motivation to conform to get kind of approval from other people. So the rules are internalized, but it's all about maintaining social order and considering other people. So at stage good, it's all about what pleases or helps or is approved of by other people, and you judge how good or bad an act is based on other people's judgments of it. The next stage, stage 4, is about conforming to social order, and so following the rules that society puts in place. Okay. Next is the post-conventional level. This is the highest level, and so here individuals are able to make judgments, kind of broad principles of justice, distinguish between what's moral and legally right. So in the 5th stage, morality, there's this understanding that morality is a contract, and it's about this balance between individual rights and society's kind of consensus on these laws. So we understand that we have these laws and rules to maximize social welfare, but if a law compromises an individual's rights, a person can change that. And then the final category is stage 6, where here individuals have kind of a broad moral principle that guides their life, and they apply it universally. So we can see here that as kids get older, in the younger ages, there's a lot of stage 1 and stage 2 type thinking. In middle adulthood, in the 20s, we're seeing an increase in stage 3 and stage 4 type thinking. But even into the mid 30s, we're not seeing a whole lot of stage 5, and we're not seeing any stage 6 thinking. So it's worth noting that this isn't necessarily something that is done at the end of childhood. There's a couple of criticisms of Kohlberg's approach. One is that there tends to be cultural bias, so post-conventional reasoning really isn't necessarily seen in all cultures, in part because collectivist cultures really emphasize social harmony, and that one universal principle that motivates all your decisions might violate that. Another big criticism is that Kohlberg's theory was really based only on one type of data, and that's those verbal responses to moral dilemmas. If people are given multiple choice questions rather than an open-ended interview, they seem to give kind of higher order answers. And these kind of abstract moral dilemmas are very different from a real life dilemma. There's also been criticism of gender bias. He used only males. Women sometimes score lower. And so Carol Gilligan is really known for this. And she argues that there's 2 different kinds of morality. There's the morality of justice, which is kind of socially defined. It's about law and order. And then there's the morality of care, which is about concern for human welfare. And she argues that women tend to use rationale based on the morality of care as opposed to the morality of justice. More recently, she's kind of argued that Kohlberg needs to kind of identify both because men and women engage in both kinds of reasoning. And then finally, moral reasoning may vary in different situations. Depending on what kind of situation we're asking about, are we talking about the business world where really it's often guided by stage 2 kind of thinking based on instrumental exchange, Whereas if you're trying to negotiate something within a marriage, you're going to be guided by stage 3 kind of reasoning, where it's all about what's best mutually for both of you. Okay, so next is the social domain theory. And according to this theory, morality, there's kind of 3 different kinds of morality, or domains of kids' knowledge. And so this includes knowledge about social norms and conventions, and also concern about the privacy of other people. And so this research kind of focuses on understanding kids' rules in different domains. So social conventional norms focus on the social expectations that facilitate smooth and efficient functioning in society. So this is norms for table manners, greetings, etiquette, bathing practices, respecting your position in the social hierarchy, things like that. Kids of all ages consistently view kind of, so this is in contrast to moral violations, which are harming other people, or violations of justice or fairness, stealing something. And so kids of all ages consistently see moral violations as worse than social conventional violations. So they understand that it's worse to hit someone than to cut in line. And as kids develop, they expand their notion of what harm is. So in preschool, when they think about harming someone, they really focus on concrete and physical harm. By the time they get to pre-adolescence, they understand that just not recognizing an individual's needs can harm them. And so they get more complex. But both children and adolescents understand that moral rules are obligatory, they're absolute, they're universally applicable. Even if there's no written rule, it's still not okay to hurt someone else. Where they recognize that deviations from these social conventional rules are impolite or maybe disruptive, but they're less kind of bad. The final category in this domain is the psychological domain. And this is focused on beliefs and knowledge of the self and others. So this includes kind of personal issues, so your preferences and choices about your body, your privacy, your friendships, prudential issues, so kind of immediate physical consequences like safety, health, and comfort, or psychological issues like your beliefs and knowledge, kind of how much you reveal to other people. And so kids are generally pretty open-minded about these kind of personal moral dilemmas. They understand that different people make different choices. Prudential transgressions are not as bad as moral transgressions. Different people have different psychological beliefs. And so as kids get older, they kind of understand that there can be conflict between the rules in different domains, and that can lead to ambiguities and uncertainties. So if we think about things like decisions about abortion or excluding other kids from their social group, it might violate rules in one category but not the other. And so when faced with complex issues, children apply a range of reasons from different domains, depending on their age. Okay, so if we think about how kids make moral judgments, if we observe toddler interactions with mothers, they start giving toddlers cues about right and wrong as early as 16 months. And by 2 to 3 years, we really see kids understanding these kinds of moral decisions. One of the big things that we see parents doing is engaging in moral dialogues where they talk about other people's feelings, using disciplinary techniques that involve reasoning and explanation, that kind of stimulate children to think about actions and implications of their actions on others. So kids learn a lot about the consequences of breaking rules in family interactions. And in adolescence, you see them kind of accepting parental regulation and moral behavior, particularly if they have authoritative parents who establish kind of clear boundaries, legitimate boundaries between moral, conventional, and personal issues with their adolescents. Children can also learn about different types of rules from caregivers and teachers as well as their parents. A although kids tend to view teachers' authority and respect it, they see it as kind of limited to in the context of the school. But in general, kids tend to evaluate all adult messages in terms of the domain, and if the message seems to be domain inappropriate, they reject it. And so really the effectiveness depends how well the message fits a child's developmental needs. Relationships with siblings and peers often involve things like turn taking and disputes that really bring up some of these moral development things. So there are opportunities for kids to learn moral as well as social conventional rules. They also talk to each other about moral transgressions, which helps them learn what's okay or not okay. And often kind of experiences in friendships with loyalty and betrayal can help with moral learning as well. Also, kind of the content of these personal issues varies across culture. So we see kind of general distinction between moral, social, conventional, and psychological domains universally, but kind of what is a social convention in one culture may differ from another. Okay, an important part of moral behavior, so we're going to switch from kind of the cognitive aspect to the behavior aspect. An important component of this is self-regulation. You have to be able to use strategies and plans to control your behavior, even if you're not being watched. So there's 3 general stages. In the control phase, kids are really depending on adults to control their behavior. If there's no adult present, they're going to do what they want. In the self-control phase, kids comply with adult expectations even in the absence of adults. And then in the self-regulation phase, kids are able to use strategies to plan and direct their own behavior without the help of adults. We've watched the video of the marshmallow test, looking at delay of gratification, and so this is an example of self-regulation. And so kids differ at the rate at which they go through these 3 phases, but parents and caregivers certainly play an important role. When kids have kind of a cooperative and affectionate and responsive relationship with their kids kind of develop a conscience and internalize their values earlier. There are also individual differences in self-regulation that can affect moral behavior. So temperament is a big one. Kids who have better inhibitory control are better at self-regulation. They're more likely to internalize the rules of conduct and comply even if adults are not watching. And we can distinguish between kind of passive inhibition from fear or anxiety versus active inhibition, where kids are making a conscious decision to not engage in the behavior. And it's worth noting that generally kids are pretty consistent in moral behavior, even in different situations, and it's relatively stable across development. Okay, next we're going to talk about moral emotions. There are individual differences in moral emotions, so not all kids feel equally guilty when they violate a moral rule. Kids with more fearful temperaments experience more guilt, and parents can play a big role in this. So by creating kind of a positive or negative emotional climate at home, providing explanations and expressing their own emotions, parents can really impact their children's emotional development. So when parents express sympathy, these kinds of things help kids learn. So this figure looks at how parent behavior is particularly important for kids who don't have a temperament that predisposes them to develop moral emotions. So this is how much guilt kids show according to their parent. The solid line is temperamentally inhibited kids. And the dotted line is uninhibited kids. And so what you can see is the x-axis is inconsistent discipline. So high inconsistent discipline means parents are not very consistent. And what you can see is for those uninhibited kids who have inconsistent parenting, they show very low guilt, which means that they're more likely to engage in unacceptable behavior. In contrast with low inconsistent discipline, this is a double negative, but basically this means if they get consistent discipline, those uninhibited kids don't do so bad. So it shows this kind of interaction between the type of discipline they get and the kid's own temperament. So this guilt is really important. By about 4.5, the anticipation of guilt deters from misbehavior and rule violation. But interestingly, shame, while it's correlated with externalizing symptoms, doesn't seem to kind of have the same inhibitory function. So guilt, but not shame, seems to be really important in motivating moral behavior. And kind of in summary of this section, in everyday life, the three components of morality occur together, right? So cognitive, thinking about the moral problems, behavioral, what you actually do, and the emotional, how you feel about it, all work together. And by about ages 3 to 4, kids are really integrating those. But not all kids are successful at that. So some may have a limited cognitive understanding. They don't understand why they did what they did, or they don't experience remorse or guilt in response to it. Okay, next we're going to shift to pro-social and altruistic behavior. So pro-social behavior is conduct that's intended to benefit others, sharing with people less fortunate, comforting or rescuing a distressed person, helping, sympathizing, performing random acts of kindness. Altruistic behavior is behavior that is intended to help other people without the expectation or acknowledgement of reward. So altruistic behavior is often anonymous, and the goal is to help other people. There's a table in your book about kind of the development of this, so I'm not going to go over that, but make sure you go through and look at kind of at what age these kinds of things develop. There's a video on Moodle that shows some of the early signs that kids, even in infancy, understand pro-social behavior. So as young as 3 months, infants prefer pro-social behavior over non-helpful behavior. By 6 months, they are more likely to help someone who's previously been cooperative. And by the end of the first year, they really understand pro-social behavior. The fact that it happens this early kind of indicates that there could be some kind of evolutionary advantage to this. And generally, these individual differences in pro-social behavior tend to start early on and continue throughout life. Kids who start out being generous and helpful and kind are likely to continue with those pro-social qualities. Okay, so this is looking at the development of some of the pro-social moral reasoning. So in preschool, we go from kind of hedonistic, so just focusing on themselves, to needs-oriented, so understanding other people's needs, but not a lot of sympathy or guilt. Approval-oriented is really worrying about what other people will think or approve of. Empathic orientation in older elementary school and early high school, where there's a lot of feelings of sympathy. So you can see this kind of progression from the focus on the child to the focus on other people. There's some interesting evidence that suggests that girls show more pro-social behavior than boys. Although it depends on the particular action. So girls tend to display more consideration and kindness. They're more empathic. They're somewhat more likely to be helping, comforting, and sharing. Although we don't see gender differences where we observe behavior and where these kind of pro-social actions are anonymous. And it's interesting because the gender differences tend to be more pronounced when they come either from self-reports or from family members and peers compared to if we do objective observations, which suggests that maybe some of these gender differences are more about what people expect girls versus boys to do compared to what they're actually doing. Okay, in terms of biological influences, the early appearance of prosocial behavior really suggests that human beings are biologically prepared to respond empathically and engage in prosocial activities. The fact that we see helping and sharing, even in non-human animals, suggests that there's some kind of evolutionary basis. We see identical twins are more alike on prosocial behavior compared to fraternal twins, indicating that this is genetic. There's studies with brain lesions that show that individuals with certain lesions have deficits in empathy. And there's brain imaging studies that show certain areas of the brain when people are feeling empathy. And of course, temperament, which is biologically based, plays a big role in children's prosocial behavior. But there are also pretty strong environmental influences. So children acquire prosocial concepts and behaviors by watching and imitating prosocial models. Parents that focus kids' attention on the consequences of their actions promote prosocial behavior. And kids that encourage parents that encourage their children's prosocial behavior by responding to emotions in a sensitive way, and kind of giving them opportunities to engage in prosocial acts can encourage that in their kids. Peers are also important, so children tend to spend time with peers who are similar to them on prosocial behavior, and they can act as models. And teachers can also influence children's prosocial behavior. There are also cultural influences. So this figure comes from a study looking at China versus Canada. And basically, cultures where kids contribute to family welfare by taking care of younger siblings and things like that, typically in non-industrialized countries, lead to more altruism. So generally, more Western countries have more individualistic priorities where there's an emphasis on the individual, whereas collective cultures tend to focus on the family, and we see actually more altruism. And so some collectivist cultures even believe in that taking credit for a good deed is bad. So different cultures kind of emphasize altruism more or less than others. And so finally, by the time that they're about 2 years old, kids have the capacity to empathize with another person's emotional state. And this is looking at kind of some of the processes that go into this. They need emotional insight. They need to be able to take other people's perspectives and express emotions in order to feel empathy, right? You have to identify the emotion and imagine what somebody else is feeling to feel that empathy. And feeling that empathy is what promotes prosocial behavior. So that is the end of this lecture.